This week's episode is sponsored by Leica.
You're listening to the B&H Photography Podcast. For 50 years, B&H has been the professional source for photography, video, audio, and more. For your favorite gear, news, and reviews, visit us at bnh.com or download the B&H app to your iPhone or Android device. Now here's your host, Alan Weitz.
Greetings and welcome to the B&H Photography Podcast. My name is Alan Weitz.
And I'm Jill Waterman.
And if history proves our guide, our audio engineer Mike Weinstein will no doubt enter from stage right with a question or two along the way. Okay, think about this. Can you name a single person who has markedly influenced your path in photography? I know I can name at least 5, maybe 6 people who helped shape my career over the years, and I cannot thank them enough. What role has a mentor played in getting you where you are today? And how much time do you dedicate on a regular basis to furthering your knowledge about the art and craft of photography? And what about your photographic practice? How much time do you dedicate to simply taking pictures and sharpening your eye? These are just a few of the topics we'll unpack in today's discussion about photo mentors and lifelong learning with colleagues and photo workshop pioneers Reid Callanan and Craig Stevens. We'll give you the full skinny on Reid and Craig in a minute, but first, we'd like to give a shout out to superfan Tim Floyd Photo for his YouTube comment about our show, Say Less with Dr. Greg Gulbranson, which he found to be particularly inspirational. To borrow Tim's words, and I quote, "Greg is a humanist who uses his hands in the clinic and on the camera to do powerful work and to make meaningful changes in people's lives," end quote. Thanks, Tim, and kudos to Greg. We couldn't agree more. And for what it's worth, we received copies of Greg's book recently, and I have to tell you, it's one of the most powerful photography books I've seen in a really long time. The Good Doctor nailed it. It's a haunting book, absolutely haunting. For a future shout-out of your very own, simply post a comment about your favorite episode, either on B&H Photo's YouTube channel or the B&H Explorer blog. We consider you, our listeners, to be an integral part of the podcast, which is why your thoughts and ideas are important to us. On behalf of the entire podcast crew, many thanks for your wonderfully positive ratings, reviews, and continued engagement. Now back to our guests. Reid Callanan is the founder and director of the Santa Fe Photographic Workshops. In addition to all of the responsibilities involved in leading the workshops for the past 32 years, Reid is also an accomplished photographer in his own right who jumps on the opportunity to teach workshops whenever he can. Reid's journey in photography started in 1974 during a semester abroad at Richmond College in London. He's been making images ever since using a variety of photographic processes. After spending 14 years at the Maine Photographic Workshops, Reid headed west in 1990, where he founded the Santa Fe Photographic Workshops and the nonprofit Santa Fe Center for Photography, now known as Center. In addition to serving as Center's vice president of the board of directors, he serves on the president's council of the Texas Photographic Society. He's a board member for the American Society of Media Photographers Foundation and the National Center for the Photograph. Craig Stevens is a photographer, printmaker, and photographic educator. He's taught, written about, and lectured extensively on art and education since 1975 when he received his MFA from Ohio University. He was associate director of the Maine Photographic Workshops for 12 years, where he was also involved in the creation and development of the workshop's resident program. In 1994, he was the workshop's director for the 25th anniversary of Les Rencontres Internationales de la Photographie in France. Additionally, Craig has served on the faculties of the Santa Fe Workshops, the Anderson Ranch Art Center, and Les Ateliers de l'Image in France. In 2013, he was the first recipient of the Susan Carr Educator Prize awarded by the American Society of Media Photographers. In 2023, after 34 years of teaching with a title of Professor Emeritus at the Savannah College of Art and Design, Craig took leave of teaching and began his next chapter, which includes, first and foremost, chatting with us today. Craig and Reid, welcome to our show.
Thank you, Alan. It's great to be here.
Bonjour, Alan.
Anyway, Reid, let's start with a question for you. We came up with the theme for this show based on a project statement from your Homescapes photo series, which identified Craig Stevens as your first mentor. Can you take us back to that moment you made that realization?
I can. And I will qualify that statement, Alan, by saying that Craig is my one and only mentor. I really think that he is the instrumental force behind my photographic career. So thank you, Craigo. It's nice to share this soundstage with you. So I first went to the Maine Photographic Workshops from Baltimore, Maryland, where I was after college, spending a year trying to do photography, and decided that I needed to go to Maine. I'd worked at a summer camp on the coast of Maine when I was a teenager, and so I knew that I loved Maine. And when I found out that there was a photography school in Maine, I jumped on it. I had no idea what a workshop was at that point, but it was a photography school. So I decided that I wanted to go and spend some time in Rockport, Maine. And the first step in that process was to sign up for a 2-week intermediate photography, black and white darkroom class. And it was taught by Craig Stevens. Didn't know who Craig was, showed up in Rockport. And I remember the first day that we were in class and we were asked to put pictures up on a critique board. And I put up a number of little black and white nature scenes that I had done at Popham Beach in Maine. And they were little gems, I thought, of quiet landscapes. And Craig stepped up to the critique board and said, "Reminds me of Caponegro." And I just about fell over because I was studying Paul Caponegro and his work at that point, and I was emulating what I thought he was talking about and showing in his pictures. And all of a sudden, there's this guy standing there that said the exact same thing to me that I was working on. And that was the first indication to me that this guy is in tune with me, but he also knows what he's talking about.
Good points.
So I spent the 2 weeks with Craig, and Sharon Fox was the course assistant for that class. It changed my life. And I learned more in those 2 weeks than I had in 3 or 4 years of working in photography on my own. That was the first inkling that I had of the power of a photographic workshop, that immersion, which we'll talk about a lot more today. But that immersive process in terms of learning is really, I think, one of the most profound things you can do to further learning some subject. So I spent 2 weeks with Craig in the darkroom, learning how to develop film, how to print. I knew how to do it, but I didn't know how to do it until Craig kind of showed me. And after the 2 weeks, my goal was to get a job in Rockport and then apply for the resident program, which Craig had founded, which started in September. And after the 2 weeks, Craig said to me, "What about if I could get you a fellowship here?" Fellowship is a fancy name for the work study program. And so I said, "Sure, that'd be great." So Craig went to David Lyman, the director of the workshops, and said, "I've got this kid who will work his butt off. Can we give him a fellowship?" And David said, "Sure, I don't see why not. It doesn't cost me anything." So I was awarded a fellowship and spent the next 2 months, July and August, working my butt off, as I knew I had to do and I wanted to do, because the goal was to be in the resident program. And the goal for me was not to sit in on workshops, even though I did. I just worked my butt off. And David noticed and Craig noticed. And when the fall came around, they offered me a job to be the darkroom manager. They said, "This kid's great. All he does is work. Why shouldn't we keep him on board?" So I stayed on board. Didn't have to pay for the resident program. I took it as a trade. So the darkroom manager would get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, be down to the darkrooms at 6, get the wood stoves cranked up so we could keep the place warm and heat the chemistry up, and then close it down at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, midnight, and go home and sleep and come back the next day and do it all over again. They were the glory days. They were great. I learned so much being part of that resident program, which was with Richard Procopio and Carson Graves, and Craig were the primary instructors at that early stage. And the other thing that Craig influenced me right away was in the resident program, I showed a number of landscapes in the genre of Caponegro. And Craig said to me, "These are beautiful. They're really, really lovely, but I don't see any of you in these pictures. I don't get any sense of who you are in these pictures." I said, "Okay, well, that kind of makes sense. What do I do?" And Craig said, photograph every day. I said, like a diary? He said, yeah, just make pictures of your life, make pictures of your house, of your cats, of your garden, the things that are important to you. Take the camera with you all the time. It's easier to make pictures when you have a camera with you. Craig didn't originate that. I think maybe Jay Maisel did. But anyway, Craig said that to me. So that early diary work turned into homescapes, which I am still doing. I taught an online workshop called Homescapes during the pandemic, which was wildly successful. And the theme of Homescapes started with that simple assignment that Craig gave me of basically photograph your life. And that's advice that I give to a lot of photographers now is if you want to make a picture more intimate, more unique, you've got to photograph how you see the world, how you are in the world, because that's all you have that's unique. Everything else has sort of been photographed already. So early on, I decided that this guy, Craig Stevens, had it going on. And he knew what he was talking about. He knew how to teach, been trained by Arnold Gasson at OU. And he was a master teacher, from my perspective, in the first day that I spent with him. And then that proved to be true over the next 14 years in Maine. And now still is true because I'm fortunate to hire him to teach in Santa Fe and have for many years. So to say he's a mentor is an understatement. He really is responsible for my career at the Maine Photographic Workshops and then to the Santa Fe Workshops after that. So it's been 50 years, pretty much. 1974 is when I started photographing. That was 50 years ago. And I owe so much to my mentor, Craig. So I'll shut up now and you can talk to Craig.
What's really amazing about what you just told us? As you're answering the question, I'm scrolling through the script that we prepared. I asked the first question, you just answered the first two, part of the third, and about 80% of, I think, 6 other questions we have here. It's masterful the way you did it.
I knew that.
So we're just going to fill in the gaps if we go along here, okay?
Okay, that's fine.
No, it's great. It's really, really good. Anyway, a question for Craig. And Craig, what were your early impressions of Reid? Do you recall what kind of direction or advice you gave him back then? We got that, okay. And do you recall how it worked out? Did he listen to you or did he just smile and politely nod his head? We know that's not the case. Anyway, fill in the gaps.
Well, I just have to say that in the course of everyone's life, you meet people that matter. And probably my relationship with Reid as a friend and as a mentor has really been a treasure. Reid is kind of like Dorian Gray in that I don't think he's changed over the 50 years that we've known each other. It's just unbelievable how youthful he has remained. And I've got this picture of him carrying a pile of wood into the workshops, as he said, to put the fires out or bank the fires up for the day's work. What he neglected to say about going home at 10 o'clock at night is coming back at midnight when there was a creosote fire and the Union Hall chimney looked like a torch. But my impressions of Reid early on were the same as they are now. Reid is one of the most sincere, sensitive, honest, intelligent people that I've ever met. And that intelligence and sensitivity was there in those photographs that I was looking at. And I know one of the questions coming up is, who have I had as mentors? And my suggestion to Reid to photograph his life really came from my very first photo teacher, Emmett Gowan. In 1972, I tried to get into a workshop with Paul Caponegro, but the workshop had filled up very, very quickly. I don't think my work was up to the level that they would have wanted anyway. And so I was directed into a workshop with Emmett Gowan. And Emmett showed up with his family, his wife Edith, his children, one of Edith's aunts. And I just watched the way Emmett made photographs out of his life. And I was fascinated by him as an individual, and his integrity. So that's all I really passed along to Reid.
Was that the Pirate Workshops?
Yes, it was in Millerton, New York. A whole bunch of really interesting people went through there. Arno Minkinen was a workshop student there. Lauren Shaw, who teaches at Emerson College in Boston, she was on staff there. It was a really remarkable place.
Have either of you noticed recognizable patterns common to mentors that you've had?
Yeah, I have. I think that they're generous. They're able to give of themselves and they don't expect anything back.
There's also a lack of ego quite often common to these people, which is kind of nice, or at least a reduced level of ego, even amongst the best of them.
Well, for one thing, you have to just be interested in other people. I mean, if you're self-centered and narcissistic, you're probably not going to be a mentor.
The other thing I'd like to add to that
Sure.
is a mentor has to have life experience.
Oh, yes.
Mentors are typically not 25 or 30 years old. I don't see that.
I agree with you 1,000% on that. It's got to have a little bit of history. It's got to have depth, a lot of depth to it, for sure. This question is more for Craig. You've had a lot of years as a university professor interacting with a lot of young students. Has the concept of mentorship changed over time that you can notice? Does it mean something different to today's photo students compared to earlier generations?
That's such an interesting can of worms. I've been involved in education since graduate school. The workshop method, I guess I would say, vis-a-vis the teaching in a university situation, they're so completely different. When I was at the workshops, people like Reid would be coming there looking for this direction to do something profound with their life. College teaching for me was a wake-up call because not every student that was there had that kind of intensity of purpose. Some of them were there because they couldn't figure out anything better to do, which I think is probably very true in a lot of situations. I do think that that situation has changed. And I don't know that we can blame everything on the iPhone in society, but it definitely changed things because I think the way people learn, and to back up a second, I always wanted to be a teacher. I taught second grade before I taught photography. And I was also an athletic coach at various times. But the idea of learning was something that the iPhone changed when suddenly, instead of learning things, you could look them up. And it's an experiential difference. I remember I was doing a history class, and I'm actually going to be doing a history workshop online for Reid coming up in a few months. And I said something, and one of my students raised their hands and said, "How do you know this crap?" And I said, "Well, I study it." And I said, "I don't just look it up." And the expression on their faces were really kind of odd because that's what people do now. They look things up. And the problem with that is that you often don't get to the good stuff. You only get the surface. So I don't know if that answers the question, but the idea of people looking for a mentor, it's sometimes difficult in a university situation because I think the time that Reid and I spent together early on, we were together literally every day for months and months and months and then years. So you have this interaction that's going on all the time. In a university situation, I might have a student 1 10-week quarter for a total of 50 hours of class time. And that's it. So if the mentorship is going to happen, and it has happened, I do have students or slightly former students now that I consider I'm in a mentor relationship with them. It can happen, but it's got to be special.
Craig, I was really struck by something you mentioned. You referred to the workshop method, and makes me think of like the actor studio and that whole method acting.
Mm-hmm.
But just for any listeners who might not be so familiar with photo workshops, can you go a little deeper into the workshop method, that idea?
Sure. I'll start at the end of a workshop. I said to a bunch of people, it was a 1-week class, what was the most valuable thing that you got this week? And this one fellow, I think he was from New York, he was a professional person, said, I got to do what I love for 5 days in a row. And the idea of how you fit photography, and I think there was a term, avocational, which I think is a great term.
Mm-hmm.
The avocational photographer, the photographer that happens to be a lawyer, doctor, Indian chief, and they're fitting photography into their lives. There's an intensity in the workshop that allows for the kind of focus that we don't always have available to us. There's so many things that can distract you when all you really want to do is be able to concentrate on a thing that you really love to do.
Yeah.
One of the things that I recommend when I'm teaching or involved in a workshop process is to ask the students to turn off their cell phones. With that suggestion, their eyes get really big, and most of them say, oh, I can't do that. And I say, we'll start during class time. And they can buy that, they understand that. And then you extend it a little longer. So the idea is that if you can do it, and most people can do it, if they set their mind to it, you want to isolate yourself, as Craig said, from the other distractions. And our lives are full of distractions. The iPhone is the number one distractor. So if you can get people to, first of all, take a workshop away from their hometown so they're staying somewhere else. Don't go with family. Go just yourself, stay in a hotel room, Airbnb. And that process of isolation and being free and clear of distractions does lead to that level of intensity where learning just skyrockets. That's why I learned more in 2 weeks working with Craig and Sharon than I had in 3 years on my own. And I think most people will say that a truly great workshop experience, their work just catapults to the next level in that method.
Reid and Craig, Mike here. So I'm unfamiliar with workshops in general, but I've been to some meditation retreats. It sort of reminds me a little bit of this sort of deepening and seclusion and a monastic type of experience. Historically, when did the modern idea of workshops become a quote thing? Is this something that started with the arts? Because I know now today there's all sorts of workshops for real estate investors and other types of enterprises. But from your perspective, yeah.
I think the workshops started informally with places where artists tended to gravitate to work. Up here in Maine, Monhegan Island, for instance, had a whole painting colony. It was almost like a kind of a club where they could be around people of like interest. McDowell Colony in New Hampshire, where artists could come and spend time, as you said, in isolation, away from the rigors of the world to be able to focus on their work. I think, though, in photography, it really goes back to Ansel Adams and Minor White. Ansel did his workshops in Yosemite for years.
Mm.
Minor certainly was involved with that. And Minor was really the inspiration behind the Apiron workshops in Millerton, New York. The Schlesinger brothers were acolytes of Minor. And then in the middle of the country, you had the Center for the Eye in Aspen, Colorado, and that was Sherry Heiser, who started doing workshops out there in the basement of the Jerome Hotel. And that led kind of directly and indirectly to the Maine workshops happening because David Lyman, who was the person who hired me, took a workshop there with Bob Gilka from National Geographic. And David was a sailor, and he had taken this workshop with Gilka, and Gilka just basically reamed him. One of his questions was, do you actually make a living doing this stuff? And so David was sailing into Rockport Harbor on his sloop, the Quinta, and walked up the hill and found a place to rent and said, I'm going to start a workshop on the East Coast. So that's how that happened. And the other spin-off from Center of the Eye was Anderson Ranch Art Workshops in Snowmass. They actually took the darkroom equipment from Center of the Eye and moved it up there when they first started doing their workshops.
Just to give you some historical dates, Ansel's workshops in Yosemite started in the 1940s. And then Center for the Eye was in the early 70s. Same with the Pyron. David started MPW in what, 73?
73.
And you were there in 74 or 75?
74. This is my 50th anniversary this year. I keep waiting for the Rolex.
Don't hold your breath.
I'm not.
So workshops have been around for quite a while, and they have evolved a lot. And then the online learning, which is taken over by storm because of the pandemic, that's changed the equation dramatically.
Exactly. Yeah, I was just thinking about that. What are your thoughts about the differences between online workshops and the distanced learning opportunities and the immersive in-person learning experiences?
I'd say that online is a cousin of in-person. It's in the same family, but very different. And it's not certainly as immersive because you're on a screen. And we spend so much time on screens these days. You can do it for about 2 hours, 2.5 hours maybe, and then you burn out on the screen time. So we limit our online classes to 2.5 hours. So it's not as immersive, certainly. You're not in person with people. You don't feel their energy. That being said, the cost differential is significant. It's a quarter of the price. You do it from home, obviously, and you don't have any really other expenses. Another advantage is that you have a couple of days to do the assignment. Typically, the classes meet a couple times a week or maybe once a week on Saturdays. In that case, you have a whole week. So it doesn't have the same level of intensity either, but you have more time. And sometimes people want more time to do the assignments before they turn their work in and get it critiqued. But as Craig and I know, the best benefits come from an in-person workshop if you can afford the time and the fees that it costs to take it. So very different beasts. Right now, we're split down the middle between our online offerings and our in-person workshops. It's a great mix to have. We're bringing more people into the online programs because of the cost. We've also got a series of workshops we started a couple of years ago called pop-up workshops, and a pop-up workshop that happens in New York or LA or Chicago or Atlanta. And we tap into instructors that we know who live in those cities. We get staff who live in those cities. So we're cutting out of the equation the travel expenses and the housing and the car that it costs to bring somebody in to teach in Santa Fe or Maine. So classes are typically a little bit less expensive, and you've got a big metropolitan audience base that could sign up for that workshop in their hometown so they can stay home, not incur the travel expenses, still take a workshop from a great instructor, well-staffed in those cities. So that's another thing we've been working on to deal with the onslaught of competition. When Maine was started, there was one other workshop. When Santa Fe was started, there were maybe 3 workshops. Now, you can't shake a stick without hitting a workshop because everyone's doing them. Photographers are doing them. People that teach for us in Santa Fe are doing them. Magazines, manufacturers, museums. Griffin Museum is a good example of a great program that they're running out of their museum down in Massachusetts. And then other organizations that are ramping up their businesses in the workshop world. So
It raises a lot of questions in that answer, but I guess the first one that came to mind was, why aren't there workshops in large metropolitan areas? Because then the workshops have a guaranteed class of people.
well, there are some. The Julia Dean Workshop, which then morphed into Los Angeles Center of Photography, that's in LA.
But is it also perhaps the case that if the foundational inception is the workshops that Ansel Adams is running, the workshops are highlighting photography of nature or landscape photography over urban photography, and so they're better suited to be in places like Maine or Santa Fe?
I think that the destination aspect of it is not unimportant historically.
Hmm.
Art Kane at one point decided to do some workshops in Cape May, New Jersey, which is quite a lovely place. Santa Fe obviously is beautiful. Maine is beautiful. The south of France is beautiful. But a funny story about the Rencontre in France, Louis Baltz was teaching a workshop there, and his first field trip was to take his class to the local dump. He wanted to get him over the sunflowers and the lavender really quickly, which he did. I've always thought that was one of the most creative and funny first field trips that you could ever do to somebody who shows up in the south of France. Let's go to the dump. But the geography of where a workshop is often the idea that, well, I can go there, I can study photography, and I can have a vacation. The other thing in terms of the online, on ground aspect, I have been teaching a class called Alternative Digital Printmaking, where it's all about creating custom substrates and the need for a physical plant to be able to do that. That kind of workshop has to happen in person.
So we've talked a little bit about the idea of destination workshops and workshops in different international sites. Is there anything that you think prospective students need to keep in mind before going to a destination workshop that's perhaps not associated with a set educational environment?
I'd like to answer that one first, which is you got to be careful with syntax here. International workshop is probably not a workshop. My guess is that probably 90% of international trips for photographers are not workshops, they're tours.
Yeah.
And there's a big difference. And if you don't know the difference, you need to learn it because a workshop that Craig and I know about, it's in our DNA, is lots of feedback on a daily basis, making new work, looking at that work, getting critiqued, having an assignment, photographing the assignment, bringing that back in. That's a workshop, that constant feedback. In most travel trips, you don't get that, in part because if you're in Cuba or if you're in the south of France or if you're in Morocco, why would you want to spend 3 or 4 hours a day in a classroom setting? That doesn't make a lot of sense. So by its very nature, you want to be out photographing in that location. That's what you've primarily gone for. You may go for an instructor, but you're going to Morocco for Morocco. You're going to Cuba to see Cuba and meet the people. Yeah, you might have a great instructor that's leading that attracted you to that program. We don't call our trips to Cuba workshops. First of all, you can't legally do that because of the OFAC regulations. You can't teach workshops in Cuba, according to the US government. We do workshops in San Miguel. We call them workshops because we have a campus there. We have a hotel we've been using for 20 years. We have classrooms. We meet every day. The model of a workshop in Santa Fe or in Rockport happens in San Miguel. So those are true workshops. We also do trips or tours. We call them international destination trips all over the world. And those are not workshops because they may have a critique midway through. There may be a critique at the end. What we're doing now is we're having the critique after the trip is over online. For example, Arthur Meyerson just took a trip to Spain and he had 12 students. They went through Spain. He probably did some one-on-ones with people looking at the back of their camera or on their laptop, but that was the extent of the learning that happened through Arthur.
If I may jump for a second, there is a photographer whose name I won't mention because we all know his name. He's really well known for a long time, who runs workshops. They're called workshops there, and I think the one particular one was a Cuba trip that a friend of mine was on, and was actually astounded that this person didn't like being interrupted during the day because he himself was busy taking pictures. and would just make you feel like
Mhm.
crap if you tapped them on the shoulder to ask a question in the middle of this quote unquote
Mhm.
workshop. So I think that is sort of what you're alluding to right there. And that is a big difference.
It's a huge difference.
If I'm paying that money, I want to be able to ask a question.
So yeah, get to know the vocabulary and what to ask for and what you want. If you want a workshop experience, then that's great. On the other hand, you probably want to spend as much time out photographing as you can if you're in Marrakesh or in Arles. So you probably don't want a workshop. But knowing the difference is the most important thing. And thank you, Jill, for asking that question.
Yeah, no, it's a really great distinction to make.
Has it come up that students' expectations weren't met and they were disappointed or?
All the time.
Uh-huh. Huh.
All the time.
Well, that's my friend's point was he went on with his hero on a great trip. he really felt like he couldn't ask this person any questions. He was interfering with their trip.
I would actually say to anybody who's thinking about doing something internationally, read the reviews, find out who's taken the class, what were their experiences about.
Yeah.
And I think Reid is spot on with the differentiation between a tour and a workshop. I did workshops in France for 20 years, from 82 to 2002. I actually had a dark room, a classroom, and it was also 2 weeks long. There was adequate time for doing the field work and doing the shooting and the subsequent critiques that would take place throughout the workshop. So there are workshop possibilities outside of the country, but you need to pay attention to what they are.
So I want to bring the conversation back to the idea of mentors and mentorship for a bit. And Reid, I understand that Santa Fe is now offering 2 different types of online mentorship programs broken down into either 8 or 17 sessions. How long have you been offering that program, and how's it been received by students?
We've actually been offering that for quite a while, Jill.
Huh.
I think probably 15 years. So well before the Zoom world that we live in now, we were doing it. And the mentorships happened typically over the phone. Can you believe that? But that's how it started. And it ran really well for the first 5 years or 6 years. We were teaming up one of our instructors who agreed to be a mentor with students who needed this kind of relationship that Craig and I have had for so many years, and other people I'm sure have had as well. And it worked really well. Every 3 weeks, there'd be an assignment. They would go out and photograph and then send work back to the mentor. They'd get on the phone for a couple hours and talk about the work. So it was kind of crude when we look back at those times. People actually had phones and they were talking on phones that long. Then it kind of petered out for a while because of the internet and because of the iPhone and all the things we've talked about earlier. And now there is a little bit of a resurrection because of Zoom and how easy it is. And Zoom is ubiquitous. Everybody knows the language of Zoom and how to do it. And most people have a pretty good setup. So it's much easier now to have a mentor and meet with them, whether it's 1 week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks, and have that relationship built over Zoom where you can actually share work easily. You can see the person. It's a much richer experience. So we're seeing more interest now in the mentorship program. It's really about how much money you want to spend and how much time you have to devote to it. So it's a program that we will continue and hope that it continues to be well received. And most people who sign up for mentorship, because it is fairly expensive, do their homework and they look at our mentor pool. And then I have a conversation with them, talk about their goals. I can give them options in terms of maybe somebody else that they might consider. So there's quite a bit of onboarding that happens before the actual mentorship program starts. But they are wildly successful because if you think about the ability to work one-on-one with one of our instructors that's catered to just what you need, and that kind of feedback doesn't happen really in many other professions.
Yeah, that's very cool. So when researching the word mentor, I came upon a distinction between mentoring and coaching. And they're both methods of developing people, but they have different purposes and different approaches and structures. What are your thoughts about those 2 different types of roles and how they differ?
This is in deference to what Reid's doing with Santa Fe. But a mentorship often is very informal. For me, in terms of my own experiences, I never said to Paul Caponegro, "Will you be my mentor?" It just happened. And the same thing was true with Jean-Pierre Soudre in Lacoste. It just happened. Coaching, I think, is something that is sought out. And I'm thinking my own experiences as an athletic coach, where somebody comes to me and says, "Can you help me with something?" And it's about observation and critique and changes made to a framework that the person's working with. Whereas with a mentor, for me, it's, having a coffee and just talking about what's going on.
I agree with that. Coaching is short term, it's
Mm.
skill based, and there's usually a couple different outcomes that you want, and those are known in advance before you even start the coaching experience. As Craig said, mentorships is more just life experience. And thinking about
Mm.
my relationship, my mentorship with Craig, I never asked him to be a mentor. It just happened. It happened because we shared our lives together for so many years in Rockport. In addition to spending those hours with Craig in the darkroom, then I would go to his house for dinner. Then we start watching sports. And then we started playing duck pin bowling together. And we started playing golf together, which I was terrible at.
Generally speaking, would you say there are any boundaries in a mentor-mentee relationship that either party should consider or be careful not to cross?
That's a great question.
Or is it just dependent on an individual relationship?
I think the only boundaries are what you would have between two human beings. There are always lines that you don't cross. I think personally, and I'm trying to remember uh, exactly who said it to me, but somebody very smart said, "You'll never go wrong being kind to another person. You might get into trouble not being kind, but you'll never get into trouble being kind to another person." And so, as a human being, I try and treat everyone with the same kind of respect that I think they deserve. And if you do that, if you are in a situation with someone where you have a relationship with that person, if you just keep that in the forefront, nothing's going to go wrong. If you abuse that, if you forget that, then you have things that happen. I think the relationship that a teacher has with a student is a sacred trust because they're putting themselves in your hands. And I think we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years some of the horrible things that have come out where teachers, professors have seriously abused that trust. It's all about just being a good human being.
Yeah, that's well said.
Okay, we are going to take a short break for traffic and weather. And whatever else you want to do in that short time, we come back more with Reid Callanan and Craig Stevens. Stay tuned.
Leica's M11D rangefinder camera is the new classic for photography enthusiasts. On the outside, its timeless film camera design has no rear display, only an ISO dial, so you can snap photos just like in the old days. On the inside, its 60-megapixel BSI CMOS sensor captures high-resolution images with noise reduction and high color accuracy for incredible detail, even in low light. With a balance between an electronic and mechanical shutter, 2 digital zoom steps, and 14 stops of dynamic range, the M11D is a photo camera with digital heart and an analog soul. Head on over to bnh.com for more information about the Leica M11D rangefinder camera.
Okay, we are back with Reid Callanan and Craig Stevens talking about mentorships and photography. And here's a question for both of you. Let's talk more about the learning experience. There's a discrete learning such as tackling a specific skill or task. And then there's a broader category of lifelong learning, which is more self-directed. In your experiences, how has the concept of lifelong learning evolved in recent years, if it has?
I think it's more important now than ever before. And I think that's because of the distractions that are out there in our world and how fast paced things are and how easily distractible we are. And to counterbalance that, learning something new is really a huge benefit in people's lives, taking time to slow down and focusing on something that is going to help them mentally and physically. And so many people right now are trying to navigate through the aging process. And the audience that we deal with at the workshops, Craig's different because he's been dealing with younger people at SCAD. And I'm interested to hear what he has to say about this. But the audience that I deal with, for the most part, are baby boomers, people in their 60s and 70s who have probably retired or about to retire and have a passion for photography. And they're looking for something that they can take up in their retirement years, in their golden years, so to speak. And a lot of people have latched onto this idea of being a lifelong learner. And it has been proven that it has both physical and mental benefits to devote yourself to that learning experience, that learning process. And so I think it's really popular right now in the baby boom generation to be called a lifelong learner. And I'm not sure that was true 20 years ago when all these baby boomers were still in their careers and really busy and didn't have the time to think about learning something new. So that's a generational thing from my perspective. So Craig, what about your experience with that term lifelong learners? Does that even resonate with students at SCAD? Probably not, right?
This idea of lifelong learning, no, I don't think my university students, they don't think long term most of the time, and neither did we when we were 19, 20, 21 years old. I had an experience this the other day reading a book that I recommend called A Chance Meeting: American Encounters by a woman named Rachel Cohen. And I don't know how much fiction is involved in this, but there are encounters that take place between individuals. One of them is Matthew Brady and Ulysses S. Grant. Another one that I just read was Edward Steichen and Alfred Stieglitz. And of course, I've been teaching history forever, and I always talk about Gallery 291, little galleries of the photo succession. And I never realized until reading this thing that Steichen and his bride had been living in 291 and moved to 293 Fifth Avenue. And those rooms were available that Stieglitz then rented to have the gallery. I never knew that. And maybe I'm a nerd. I am a nerd. But I just thought, wow, that's really cool. I just learned something new. And I'm pushing 80. So, I think lifelong learning, I think, probably when you stop being interested in learning, it's probably going to be over very soon. I think actually the idea of continual learning is what really keeps you vital, not necessarily young, but vital.
Mm.
I can't argue with that at all. I know personally, I've been shooting for well over 50 years now, and I still get excited about a new weird lens or a new kind of camera that enables me to do things that my previous gear did not allow me to do. And yeah, it's a giggle. It's kind of fun. It's nice to keep going and keep pushing. If I could throw an extension onto this part of the conversation, yesterday I started a new little sideline for myself. Local high school asked if I could run a photography club, and they had 6 students who were interested in learning about photography. So I go, sure. So it's 45 minutes a week. So it's really little slices of time. And I met with them for the first time yesterday, and they all want to know about photography, and basically they have phones. That's what they have. And I realized this is going to be a real challenge trying to explain like the basic principles. And my savior was that they put me into a class that's used for physics. And the teacher who normally was in that class was in the corner working on lesson plans, and she's listening in. And she comes over, she says, I think you can use this. And she gave me essentially a shoebox that was turned into a pinhole camera with the top removed, and then a white translucent sheet that goes back and forth that you could focus on. And we took it to the window, and I was able to explain the basics and the essence of a camera and photography, and they all got it. And I couldn't do that with a phone. And I realized
Yeah.
what a challenge this is. And that's going to be the challenge of the year. I'm going to be teaching photography to people who are their total experience, as far as I see right now, is going to be using this phone. And we'll make it work somehow, but it's definitely a challenge. But that's their world. Now, what I am doing next week is I have from 1903 a 5x7 field camera. That I'm going to bring in, because that I could flip the shutter on, and that you could see everything going on in the background. And so a little bit of more of an explanation and real primitive of what happens with the camera, but we'll get past all of that stuff.
The other thing that gets to the young people's attention is the black and white darkroom. To see that point come up in the developer grabs a lot of people. And
Yes.
so all these experiences that we all grew up with are ones that if we can expose, pardon the pun here, the young photographers that are using their iPhones to it, then it takes them down a different path.
It's interesting that there's two problems with trying to learn photography as a a real serious avocation or vocation today. One is the effortlessness of and the lack of darkroom techniques and analog film cameras. But the second challenge is the fact that you are raised at this point, from when you're a young teenager with a camera in your hand at all times, but you don't really see it as a camera. It's a different type of thing, and so you have to recalibrate people's understanding, I guess, of how significant this device could be if used mindfully, and with intention.
I think mindfully is the perfect word right there, because Keith Carter, when he does his slideshow, starts off with this number on the screen, and it's the number of photographs posted to social media that day. And it's mind-boggling, of course. And the vast, vast, vast majority of all of those photographs have no mindfulness at all in terms of the consciousness of making an image. The iPhone democratized photography. It took it out of the realm of being a plaything for people with disposable income, so that anybody who actually had a phone was able to make pictures. But it also, in many ways, diminished the importance of making a photograph. I think there are a lot of things there to think about.
I have to actually jump in here to add something to this, and that yes, the phone camera is a major shift in how we experience photography. But I want to go back further than that, and I think you'll be able to identify what I'm going to speak about, and that's when I started taking pictures. I was in High School of Art and Design back in the late 60s, and this is when light meters were first being built into the camera. It used to be you'd have a hand meter or a little one that slipped on that maybe held on to the shutter speed dial. So as you move the f-stop, anyway, it was all manual. and autofocus, yeah, you autofocus before you take the picture. That's what it boiled down to. Now, from there, I went into magazine photography. And at that point, it still was an art and a craft. Magazines hired a writer, and they hired a photographer. One person wrote about the story, the other person photographed the story. And then the Olympus OM1 came out with an amazing meter that had program capability. And then we had autofocus. And before I knew it, the writers I used to work with were given cameras by the company they worked for, the publishers. And yeah, your pictures may not be good as Al's, but technically you can take a technically good picture and we could save money, and we don't have to spend airfares, and we don't have to have meals, and we don't have to have hotels and rent. All that stuff went away. So I'm going to say that we photography changed more or equally when auto exposure came through, and then more so with autofocus, because that's when anybody could take a technically good picture.
Well, the history of photography has been one continual evolution of technical improvements from day one.
Yeah.
And so it's really, as you said, it's nothing new, but the sheer magnitude of it now is, I think, what's daunting. And the other thing that I always
Mm-hmm.
point out to my students is that when I started photography, it took me 2 years to get to the point of being mediocre.
Yeah.
I
Thank you.
mean,
Yes.
no, just
Yeah.
getting a roll of film onto a reel and
Mhm.
in and out of a tank, and to get actual pictures on a piece of film, that was a big deal. And now you're born mediocre. You take the camera out of the box, and
Yes.
it's actually even better than mediocre. I mean, I always say, when have you ever seen a bad exposure on Instagram? You don't. You know, the iPhone can
Right.
take pictures in available darkness. I mean, you can take a picture of your steak in a dark restaurant with no flash and it still comes out. But the thing that never goes away is spirit, soul, and vision. And those three things can still make magic. There's no question about it.
Something that I
Mm.
grapple with whenever I have to
Mhm.
deal with editing other people's pictures or critiquing other people's pictures, and you've both been faced with this same thing. We all have criteria of what makes a photograph, quote unquote, good or strong or dynamic. And I'll be straight out there. Most photographs I see from most people are crap. I see so much junk out there, so much garbage. How do you broach that? I mean, and separate it from our own taste. I mean, yeah, I don't like it. I think it's crap. But other people think it's really, really good, and maybe it is good, but not to me. How do you deal with that, especially with a student? You don't want to crush them. How do you approach these things?
I'm going to answer this one first, Reid.
Sure.
We should never forget how important our relationships with another person are,
Mm-hmm.
even if they seem trivial. When I was taking my workshop with Emmett Gowan, I was sitting across the table from Emmett at a Pyron. We were drinking lemonade with fresh mint in it. I had never had that before. And we were eating a piece of carrot cake
Mm.
with cream cheese frosting. That was absolutely
Mm.
delicious. And I asked him, what's the difference between a good photograph and a bad photograph? And he took a bite of carrot cake and he looked at me and he said, there's no difference between a good photograph and a bad photograph. Some photographs just last longer than others. Now, a few years later, when I was teaching at SCAD, I had Emmett come down to lecture. And I can still remember the first line of his talk. All photographs are documents, but only some of them enter your imagination.
Excellent. I like that. That's a keeper. That's a keeper.
You know, you can't make that stuff up. I mean, it was perfect. And you know what? It was exactly what I needed to hear at that moment in my photographic, if I could call it, life, because I really didn't know, I only knew what I saw in magazines and saw in books and saw in galleries. So everything that I did was really very derivative of those things. But there are still photographs that I made 50 years ago that I look at and I say, yeah, that's still there. And there are others that fall away. And so, really, one's photographic body of work is typically going to be self editing. And if the person remains involved in their growth, the good photographs will stay, and the not so good ones will, as Cartier-Bresson says, go to the trash, the garbage.
Which is actually very liberating. If you've ever really gone through your work and filled up black trash bags and just let it all go, it is actually quite liberating. It really, really is. And the stuff that you have left behind is usually a lot better than the stuff you threw out. On the same line of thought here, being a photo educator is a big responsibility, as we're realizing here. But sometimes teachers can learn a lot from their students. Are there any memorable occasions when you found yourself in this position where you're learning from a student? And this is for both of you. Go ahead, fight it out.
All the time.
I would say the same thing. And then I'll let Craig give an example. because he has a lot more experience teaching. I don't teach that often. I've taught some online classes during the pandemic, and I teach maybe one workshop a year, whether it's in Santa Fe or in Maine. And as Craig said, all the time, if you are a skilled teacher, and Craig certainly is, and I consider myself one as well, if you're not learning from your students, you're doing something wrong as a teacher. Because you need to be open to what they bring to the equation. And just to go back to the previous question that you raised, Alan, about critiques, I started all of my critiques with the same message to the students, which is that this critique is simply my opinion about your work. One man's opinion, albeit an educated opinion, because I've looked at more photographs than they certainly have in my lifetime. And I've looked at a lot of great photographs in my lifetime. So I'm bringing an experience level and a history to the subject. And then I give my opinion about, am I surprised? Am I moved? Am I bored? What's the emotion that I feel when I look at their photographs? I don't try to destroy someone's picture making process, because that would be a bad thing to do as a teacher. But I give an opinion about why it doesn't work for me. And I think they understand at that point that it's not the be all and end all. It's how I feel about it. They can take it or leave it. Ultimately, it comes down to what they think about that photograph. And they can disagree with Craig. They can disagree with me. And that's their right, because it's their photograph. And it can live forever if they feel that way about it. Oftentimes what happens with a student showing photographs is they have the story and the emotion behind how it was made, where it was made.
Oh,
and we don't know
yes.
that story. So we're just looking at this two-dimensional object and talking about it based on what we see in front of us. It's not a very interesting picture, but they think it is because it took them 4 hours to climb this mountain, get on the top of the mountain, make the picture at sunrise. For me, it's just another sunrise picture at a mountain. And that's not real interesting. It's nothing new.
And you weren't freezing and having to pee at the same time, waiting for that sun to come up.
Right.
But that is a very important message that you just gave there, that I've brought up before with other people and talking about photographs, and that is that it's true. Sometimes we kill ourselves to get a picture, and we're just astonished that we actually got something. We came home with something.
Right.
And the story itself is phenomenal. The picture itself is boring and dull. And yeah, mazel tov, you actually came home with something. You know, we could eat dinner tonight, but not real tasty.
So there's one other aspect of critique that I want to bring up, and that's when I'm speaking with somebody about their work, good or bad is sort of irrelevant. It's about doing things one way or another, or how things would change if you did something differently, as simple as switching from horizontal to vertical, or, aspect ratio, all the different things that involve photography. And that's what I find to bring up stories that will deepen the experience and get somebody to think about their work in a different way or a new way. And maybe all of a sudden the light bulb will go off and they'll be like, oh, well, yeah, I could do something differently and it will be closer to what I'm reaching for.
Well, I think that's actually the whole issue of critique. From a teaching point of view, Christopher James and I taught a class at the Maine media workshops for a number of years, photography for teachers. And we would have teachers from grade school to graduate school. And invariably, when we would ask them, what's most important to you during this week, the issue of critique would come up, how best to do it. And we would talk about best practices for critique, and we would have people put up their work, or sometimes they would put up their students' work, and we would have someone lead the critique, and then we would actually do a critique of the critique. And what was interesting is that they would often take an approach of critiquing the work technically, whether it was good print, bad print, did it need to be spotted, blah, blah, blah. And they would rarely get around to what the photograph might be about. And so Christopher and I would kind of take over. And I remember Christopher would always say the two most important words in learning how to critique are "for me." As Reid said, that focuses the words that are being used as an opinion, as someone else's thought. And that is a kind of an insulation against the student feeling attacked. But the other thing that I learned was that you can be a lot more successful in a critique situation by asking intelligent questions, kind of peeling back the onion layer by layer by asking questions to get to what the photographer was trying to do. How well did that work? And how can we make it better? I think the difference between critique and criticism is an important one. It's often lost. It's not a pissing contest to see who's smarter than the other person. It's really about two artists getting together and trying to move to a better place. And if the photograph is successful as it is, then celebrate it. When I looked at that thing about, if I learned anything from students, I had this wonderful student named Ashley who was in my platinum printing class. And I had them put up the work that they were coming into the class with so I could have an idea of what kind of images they made. And I looked at this one photograph and I said, "Whose photograph is this?" And she said, "Mine." And I said, "This is absolutely beautiful." And her response was so lovely. "Get the out of here." I just went, "What did you just say to me?" But it was awesome. I've never forgotten that moment. It was such a thrill to meet at that place over an image. So everything is full of surprises. And I think if you go into a critique open to what you haven't seen before, rather than trying to evaluate it compared to everything that you've known before, you can open up new areas of thought.
We've actually changed our vernacular in Santa Fe. We don't call them critiques anymore. I mean, that word still gets through, but we prefer image review because critique in a lot of people's mind has to do with criticism, and they don't want to have criticism of their work. So image review tends to be a little softer. It's the same process, though.
Yeah, Doug Stewart used to do critique workshops about techniques and methods to critique work rather than simply criticize it. He made that very real distinction between those two words.
So, motivation and inspiration are essential aspects of being a good teacher. Can you talk about how these elements factor to your work with students?
I have a short answer, and then Craig can have a longer answer, I'm sure. The short answer is motivation comes from inspiration. If you can inspire your students, you're going to motivate them. That's my short answer. Craig, take it away.
Either somebody's motivated or they're not. When I decided that I wanted to make photographs, and I've done nothing for 55 years now but make photographs, and I've been so lucky to have been able to do that. I mentioned one of my mentors was the French photographer Jean-Pierre Soudre, who invented the process called mordassage that I'm sure some of you have seen. And I used to bring my classes to his studio in Lacoste. And one of my students said, "Can you ask him what kind of portfolio do I need to study with him?" And I interpreted the question, and Jean-Pierre's answer was, "They don't need a portfolio. They simply have to have passion about photography." He said, "Because that solves everything." It's a very simplistic answer, but in simplicity sometimes is great truth. And I think that if someone is really passionate about wanting to enter this area of work, it does ultimately solve all the problems.
Yeah.
So you got it or you don't. I don't think you can create it. But you can certainly destroy it. No, that just came to me, seriously, because when someone is first starting out, a really horrible teacher can just destroy them. That's where that responsibility comes in.
Mm-hmm.
And by the way, are you able to recognize within a group of students the truly motivated, truly passionate from the others pretty easily? Or does that sometimes take a while to?
Sometimes it happens quicker. SCAD had a campus in Hong Kong that, for political reasons, closed. And I had these 3 guys come to Savannah to finish their degrees. And they would all sit together in my history class. And on a Wednesday, I was talking about Oscar Raylander's photograph, Two Paths of Life. And I stood in front of this image. It's an albumin print made from 30 plus wet collodion negatives. And I stood in front of this print, and you can't tell it's a composite print. And it was at George Eastman House in Rochester. The next Monday, Willie Wong raises his hand. He said, "Hey, professor, you were right about that photograph." I said, "What photograph?" He said, "The Raylander photograph. We went up and looked at it." I said, "You flew to Rochester?" He said, "No, we drove."
Mm-hmm.
So they drove from Savannah to Rochester to look at a photograph and then drove back.
Wow.
Okay. So you recognize that pretty quickly. Others, it takes time.
Yeah.
Got a question for Craig. I noticed that your photographs have varying aspect ratios. Some are rectangular, some are square, some are panorama. Are these formats from the camera, or do you crop for visual impact or compositional reasons? And I'm not being judgmental.
No.
I'm a cropper.
All my panoramas were shot with a Linhof Technorama.
Okay.
617, which is still in my living room, and it stares at me every night. I've had that camera for over 40 years. And yeah, I mean, if I do crop, it's rare and slight to just clean stuff up.
I had a Fuji 617, so I appreciate that format. I once went out, I thought I had a whole bag of film. I had one roll in the camera. You get real selective when you have 4 frames to shoot for the day.
When I first got that camera, I decided that to get my head around the format, I would just shoot with it for a full year, nothing else.
Wow.
Reid knows this place. I was down at Pemaquid Point here in Maine, and I had my camera on the tripod. And this fellow is walking by me, and he says, "That's an interesting camera." And I said, "Oh, yeah, thanks." And he says, "Is that the only camera you use?" And I said, "Yeah." And I pointed at his Nikon, and he said, "Is that the only camera you use?" He said, "Yeah, but mine's normal." And I said, "Really?" I said, "Take a look through my viewfinder." And he looked through the viewfinder. I said, "Now look through yours." And he says, "Oh my God." So yeah, what's normal? But yeah, it's a wonderful, wonderful instrument. And one of the things that I like about it is that when you hold your arms out, it's 100-degree angle of view. And when you hold your arms out like that, it's like you're going to embrace an old friend. And that's the way it actually makes photographs. It doesn't really take them, it accepts them.
Ooh, wow. That's an interesting way of phrasing it. I like that.
I'd like to tell a story about cropping, and this comes from the resident program at MPW back in the late 70s and early 80s that I was taking part in. And Craig was the main instructor, and he didn't want us to crop images. He wanted us to use our feet to move backward and forward to get everything in the frame. He wanted to see the black border around the negative to prove that we hadn't cropped. So I, as the lab manager, had to file out the negative carriers with a metal file so we would actually print that black border so people could prove to Craig that they weren't cropping images. So we had all these negative carriers. I had to not only file them out, but then smooth them down so it wouldn't scratch the negatives when you put it in the carrier.
That's right.
So I don't know where those negative carriers ever went to, but I had to file out like 30 of them for the Omega D5s and the Bestler. It was a big job. It took me days and days, but that was because Craig had this no cropping, which he still adheres to for the most part today, right, Craig?
Pretty much, Reid.
For whatever it's worth, at SVA, School of Visual Arts, they also only had filed out holders because,
Mhm.
first of all, most people wanted to have, they liked the look of it because that was very, very cool back then.
Mhm.
And then there are the purists, they want to make sure, don't you dare crop.
That's
And I go, as soon as you
Yeah.
aim your camera, you're cropping. As soon as you change your lens, you're cropping. The only reason you have a 24 by 36 or 2 by 3 aspect
absolutely.
is because that's the shape of the opening. Your lens is taking in more area than that. I don't know. I love fighting with people over cropping. What can I
There's no
say?
fight. I mean, Arnold Newman, I worked for Arnold a number of times, and some of Arnold's most famous images are significant crops.
Mm.
There's a book on his work that actually has the contact sheets and the red wax markings, like on his Picasso photograph or the Stravinsky. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter.
There was always something I liked about you, and I could never learn that. Now I got it. Okay. That's just the cropping thing. I felt it. I just felt it. It was just
The problem with the black border is that it actually made for fairly lazy printers because they had this image corral around the image that would hold everything together. And in essence, I'm sitting here looking at my monitors right now, and I've got an image up on my screen, and it's got all of these gray borders around it. We have all of these frames that when we're working on an image, it's very easy to lose areas at the edge of a print that are too light. Ralph Gibson used to say that, a light area at the corner of a print is like an energy drain,
Mm.
and that you need to take care of that. Yeah, I apologize about those carriers, Reid.
That's okay.
I really do.
Okay.
I think the next year Bessler started selling them filed out, but
Yes, they did. Thank goodness.
oh god. And then, of course, as soon as digital came out, okay, electronically you could drop those things in, so you could fake. You
Sure.
can crop all you want and then drop in a mask.
What about photographic style and the idea of helping a student to differentiate themselves and create an identifiable style for their work? Are there any processes you use to help that along?
I'll let Craig take that one because he has taught a workshop in person and online for many, many, many years about developing a personal style. He's the expert on it. Go for it, Craig.
Yeah, boy. I think what you do is you uncover it. And sometimes students go to it naturally. I think one of the most difficult things in the digital age, in the age of film, you could put an edge on an image simply by the choice of the emulsion that you used. If you used a Fuji film or an Agfa film or a Kodak film, they often had very different color personalities.
Right.
And in digital, because of the ICC profile, I make this analogy to photography being like Hollywood squares, where everything goes to the middle. So you have to be happy being Whoopi Goldberg or Paul Lynde or whoever they put there, but you at least know you're the funniest person. If you shoot with a Fuji camera, you use Adobe software, you've got an Apple computer, you've got an Epson printer, you've got Hahnemühle paper, and all of those people have to agree what red, green, and blue are, or it's going to be a holy mess.
Mm.
So everything goes to this one kind of look, and trying to break out of that is not easy. I had a young lady at SCAD who would come in and her work could be up on the wall. And if I walked in, I knew it was hers because she had this sense about her. So she had that. And I think that if somebody works long enough, that personal vision, that style, if we want to call it that, is going to come out, but it comes from work. There's no magic assignment or pill or anything that you can give somebody that's going to make that come out. They have to do what we were talking about, when Alan was saying, go through and throw out all the crap. They have to make a lot of stuff. And then they have to figure out what matters to them. That's probably those 7 deadly questions on that our script list here.
Right.
that last one, if I could make a set of photographs, they would be, and you fill it in. Sig Harvey does a thing called a mind map. If you go to her work, it looks like a whole bunch of little bubbles on a page. And it's the way she sets herself to thinking about what's going on in her life and what she wants to work on. And I think that that's how someone really figures out where their personal style is going to be based on what's important to them. That's where it is. You go to the heart. It will probably never tell you any lies.
Mm-hmm. So, how did you come up with the 7 deadly questions? And we should probably list them one by one. It's a good assignment for people.
I'm going to give credit where credit is due. One time I had to go down to the airport in Rockland, Maine, and pick up Mary Ellen Mark and Ralph Gibson and drive them back to the workshops. And in our conversation between the airport and Rockport, these questions got thrown around inside the car.
Wow.
And it was one of the greatest taxi rides I've ever been involved with. And I hope they gave me 5 stars. But, this was our conversation. Really, how do you start a workshop? And these were questions that Ralph and Mary Ellen would ask. And I put them together.
That's great. So I'm going to just read them so people know what we're talking about. First is, what is your definition of photography? Second is, what is your greatest strength as a photographer? Third is, what is your greatest weakness? Fourth is, where would you like to be as a photographer? Fifth is, what's keeping you from getting there? Sixth is, what's the most important thing in your life? And then the last, as Craig said, is, if you could make a set of photographs, they would, and grab a piece of paper and write until you run out of things to say.
Funny story. I was awakened one morning by somebody from New York who was writing an article on creative block. And she said, "This is Craig Stevens." And I said, "Yes." And she says, "Well, I'm doing an article on creative block and somebody told me I should talk to you." And I thought, okay, just because I've got it or what? And I went through this whole thing about the questions with her. And I said, usually when somebody gets to the end of that last exercise of writing about what kinds of photographs they might make, it really starts to unlock things. Because as I said, work is the answer. You never get better at doing something by doing less of it. Maybe in minimalist cooking, but certainly not in photography. You've got to make pictures to get better.
Yeah. Well said.
One last fast question. I'm just curious, since both of you have gone from traditional to digital, and again, digital's come a long ways. You could bitch and moan about either media. Print-wise, do you feel that digital printing is equal to, or maybe even surpassed, traditional, which has been the standard forever? Are we equal right now? Equal but different at the very least?
Absolutely. The materials, and I think, Alan, you're spot on with different. I print for other artists. That's also something that I do. If you guys remember the book Midnight in the Garden of Good and Evil,
Mm-hmm.
the cover photograph of the Bird Girl statue by Jack Lee. Jack was a dear friend of mine in Savannah, and I printed his last show digitally. And after he passed, unfortunately, I printed for his estate. And I would match his silver gelatin master prints as digital inkjet prints, which is not easy to do. And I got fairly good at it. The physicality is not an issue. There are things, however, in alternative processes like platinum, gum, cyanotype, and wet collodion work that have a distinctive quality that digital does not match. I consider it one big tool bag. And, it's just, more opportunities to make beautiful things.
Right. Reid and Craig, it's been very, very good speaking to you. I got a few things off my own chest here and questions I had about, teaching and mentoring and dealing with students, which, again, it's a delicate thing. You got to be careful about that. It's a fascinating conversation. Craig, if our listeners want to catch up with more of what you are up to these days and your work, where can they go to?
Well, my soon-to-be created new website will be up soon. If they go to www.craigstevens.me, that is the website domain name. That won't change, but the site's going to change very soon.
Okay, and that'll be on our show notes as well, so a link for that. So easy, one click away. And any interesting projects coming up that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I just got done building a new studio here in my backyard in Maine that I'm sitting in right now. I've got flat files arriving this week, so I'm going to be doing that big edit that we talked about. I'll be laying hands on all of the photographs, including the one of Reid hauling wood.
Cool.
Reid, what about yourself? If our listeners would like to catch up with what you are up to, where can they go to?
I say the main thing is to go to the workshops website, which is santafeworkshops.com. I will mention that Craig is teaching 2 upcoming workshops, one online and one in person next year. So we haven't got dates yet, but starting sometime in January, we'll be doing a history of photography online workshop with Craig-O. And then next summer, probably in July, he'll come out to Santa Fe and we'll teach a fine art of black and white digital printmaking in-person workshop in our digital lab in Santa Fe. So 2 things to be aware of if you're interested in studying with Craig, which you should be. So the workshops, which is my life, that's where you need to go to find out about what we're doing. I do have a website myself, but I haven't touched it in years.
You know what that means? It means you're busy doing. That's okay. It's all right. That's okay. Listen, it's been terrific talking with both of you. Thank you both for joining us. A lot of information to digest and some good guidance there. Thank you both very, very much for joining us today. Pleasure speaking with both of you.
Likewise, thank you for the opportunity. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for asking. It was really a treat.
Thank you, Jill.
Thanks, Jill, Alan, Michael.
Awesome. So, if you are a fan of the show, but not yet a subscriber, head on over to Apple Podcasts, B&H's YouTube channel, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcast, and click subscribe. You can also find us on the Explorer blog, where we post photos from our guests along with our show notes. And please join us on Facebook at the B&H Photography Podcast group, where you can share your favorite photos and comments about the show. I'm your host, Alan Weitz. Jill Waterman is our creative producer. Episodes are recorded, mixed, and edited by technical producer Mike Weinstein. Our executive producer is Richard Stevens. And on behalf of all of us here, thank you oh so much for tuning in today.
Thanks to Leica for sponsoring this week's episode.